Leslie Walker had never imagined that inheriting her childhood home would turn into a war. When her parents passed away, leaving her their beachfront property, she saw it as more than just a house. It was a legacy, a place woven into her memories, a sanctuary by the ocean where she had spent countless summers collecting seashells, watching the tide roll in, and feeling the crisp, salty air fill her lungs. It was the only place where she truly felt at peace, where the rest of the world faded into the background, leaving her alone with the rhythmic crashing of the waves. The house wasn't just a home, it was an extension of her soul, a reflection of everything her parents had built, loved, and preserved. It was the one thing she knew she could always hold on to, no matter how much life changed. She had spent the last 15 years of her life dedicated to marine biology, traveling across the world, studying coral reefs, documenting oceanic changes, and working with conservation groups. While she had built a career in science, she had always felt tethered to the house, knowing that one day it would be hers. When the time came to settle her parents' affairs, she had been prepared for the legalities, the paperwork, the daunting task of sorting through their belongings. But she hadn't expected the battle that was about to unfold, a battle she never saw coming. The house sat on a quiet stretch of coastline, slightly removed from the more populated areas. It had been built decades ago, sturdy and timeless, with large windows facing the ocean, allowing sunlight to pour into the rooms during the day, and at night, offering an unobstructed view of the endless horizon. It wasn't extravagant, but it had charm, a personal, intimate beauty that made it unique. Unlike the newer beachfront developments that had sprung up over the years, it retained a sense of authenticity, untouched by modern excess. It was, in every way, home. Leslie had barely settled back into her routine when she met Karen Wilcox, a woman who introduced herself with an overly friendly smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. Karen had moved into the neighboring house a few months prior, but Leslie had never seen much of her until the day she showed up at her doorstep, holding a plate of homemade cookies like something out of a TV commercial. Leslie had been cautious but polite, inviting her in for a short chat, exchanging pleasantries, and assuming that would be the end of it. She should have paid closer attention to the way Karen's eyes moved around the house, lingering on the architectural details, the framed photographs, the bookshelves that lined the walls. She should have noticed the subtle tension beneath Karen's carefully controlled voice when she casually mentioned how much the neighborhood had changed over the years, how property lines had shifted, how things weren't always so clear-cut. But Leslie had been too preoccupied with settling back into her life to register the warning signs. The first time Karen made a direct comment about the house, Leslie dismissed it as an awkward joke. "You know," Karen had said, standing on Leslie's porch, her gaze fixed on the shoreline, "this place was almost in my family. My grandfather always said that land ownership back then was a mess. If things had gone a little differently, this could have been ours." She had laughed lightly, as if the idea amused her, but there was something else beneath the surface, something colder. Leslie had brushed it off with a polite smile, choosing to ignore the strange possessiveness in Karen's tone. But the comments didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, Karen became more persistent, weaving the same story into casual conversations, how her family had lived in the area for generations, how they had been cheated out of prime real estate, how unfair it was that some people got to keep properties that should have belonged to others. Leslie found it unsettling but still didn't take it seriously. People had strange attachments to history, to ideas of what could have been, and she assumed Karen was just indulging in nostalgic fantasy. Then came the unannounced visits. At first it was small things, Karen stopping by under the pretense of borrowing something trivial, asking to see parts of the house she always wondered about. Commenting on renovations Leslie had done, asking about the deed, the history, the exact details of how her parents had acquired the property. It was intrusive but not aggressive, just enough to make Leslie uncomfortable without giving her a solid reason to push back too hard. One afternoon, Leslie caught Karen in her yard, standing far too close to the property line, holding what looked like an old survey map. She was tracing something with her finger, murmuring to herself, and when she realized Leslie was watching, she quickly rolled it up, offering a bright, artificial smile. "Oh, just doing a little research," she said. "It's fascinating how land boundaries used to be marked, don't you think?" That was when Leslie's unease turned into something more tangible and instinctual awareness that something wasn't right. She started noticing Karen more often watching from her own property, standing near the fence line, staring at the house with a quiet intensity. At night, Leslie would hear the faint sound of footsteps near the edge of her yard, but every time she looked, there was nothing there. She dismissed it at first, assuming it was just paranoia, but then she started finding things disturbed: footprints in the sand near her windows, small objects moved just slightly out of place, as if someone had been inside. Then came the legal notice. A formal letter arrived in the mail, stamped with urgency. It was from a law office Leslie had never heard of, notifying her that Karen Wilcox was filing a claim on her property, asserting that a portion of it legally belonged to her. The reasoning was vague, referencing historical ownership discrepancies and outdated property records. Leslie felt a cold knot form in her stomach as she read through the document, her pulse pounding in her ears. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Karen wasn't reminiscing about the past or playing harmless neighborly games. She had been laying the groundwork for something much bigger, something deliberate. Leslie had spent her entire career studying the ocean, understanding its depths, its patterns, its hidden dangers. She knew how to read a storm before it hit, how to navigate through treacherous waters. And now, standing in her kitchen, holding a legal document that threatened to take away everything her family had built, she realized that she was in the middle of something she hadn't been prepared for, a battle she never saw coming. And Karen was just getting started. Leslie sat at her kitchen table, the letter in her hands feeling heavier than the thin paper it was printed on. She read it again, hoping that somehow she had misunderstood, that the words on the page would rearrange themselves into something less absurd. But they didn't. The letter was real. The lawsuit was real. Karen Wilcox had actually filed a claim on her property, arguing that due to some supposed error in historical land records, part of the land belonged to her. There was no indication of how Karen had obtained such records, no explanation for why this issue had never been raised before. No logical reason why Leslie's home, her legally inherited home, was suddenly under attack. Yet there it was, in black and white, a legal proceeding that demanded her response. A slow, simmering anger started to build in Leslie's chest, but she forced herself to breathe, to stay calm. Anger wouldn't help her right now. She needed to think. She needed to act. She picked up her phone, scrolled through her contacts, and called her lawyer. David Harper had handled her parents' estate and was one of the few people she trusted with something this serious. When he answered, she kept her voice steady, professional, but there was no hiding the tension in her tone. She explained the situation, and David listened without interruption. When she finished, there was a long pause before he finally spoke. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice laced with irritation. "You have clear title to that property. I handled the transfer myself. There's no legal basis for this." "Then why is this happening?" Leslie asked, gripping the edge of the table. David exhaled sharply. "Because people like Karen know that just filing a lawsuit can create leverage. Even if she has no real claim, she's hoping to push you into a settlement, force you to give up something just to make her go away." Leslie clenched her jaw. "That's not going to happen." "Good," David said, "because we're going to shut this down before it even gets started." They arranged a meeting for the following morning, and Leslie spent the rest of the night going through every document she had on the house. She pulled out the deed, the property surveys, the tax records, anything that might be relevant. Her parents had kept meticulous records, and she felt a brief moment of gratitude for their habit of filing everything away so neatly. She wanted to be ready. She needed to be ready. Because something told her that Karen wasn't going to back down easily. The next morning, Leslie met David at his office, handing over the documents as soon as she sat down. He reviewed them carefully, nodding as he went through each page. "This is solid," he said. "There's no gap in ownership, no missing records. Legally, she doesn't have a leg to stand on. Then why do I feel like this isn't over?" Leslie muttered, rubbing her temples. "Because it isn't," David admitted. "Not yet, but it will be. I'll file a response immediately, and will demand to see whatever evidence she claims to have. If she can't produce anything, this will get thrown out." Leslie exhaled slowly, feeling a small measure of relief. But it didn't last. That afternoon when she returned home, she found Karen standing at the edge of her property, holding a measuring tape, examining the ground like a surveyor. "What the hell are you doing?" Leslie called out, striding toward her. Karen turned slowly, her expression perfectly calm, as if she had every right to be there. "Just verifying some things," she said, rolling up the tape measure. Before this all goes to court." "You're trespassing," Leslie snapped. Karen smiled. "Am I? That's funny because according to the documents I have, this land isn't actually yours." Leslie's hands curled into fists at her sides. "Get off my property, Karen." Karen tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether to argue, but then she sighed and stepped back. "I suppose we'll let the courts decide," she said, turning to leave. "But I'd start preparing if I were you. This is going to be a long fight." Leslie watched her walk away, her heart pounding with rage. This wasn't just some legal ploy. Karen was trying to wear her down, trying to make her doubt herself, trying to push her into a corner. But Leslie wasn't going to let that happen. She refused to be intimidated, refused to let Karen dictate what happened to her home. But things only got worse from there. A few days later, Leslie received another letter, this time from a real estate company. It was a courtesy notice informing her that her property had been flagged for a potential sale due to the ongoing dispute. It was nonsense, of course. Her home wasn't for sale, and no one had the right to sell it out from under her, but the implication was clear. Karen was trying to create a paper trail to muddy the waters, to make it seem like there was some legitimate question about ownership. Then came the city inspection. A man showed up at her door, clipboard in hand, claiming that there had been anonymous reports of zoning violations on her property. He was polite but firm, insisting that he had to conduct a formal review. Leslie, caught off guard, had no choice but to let him in. He walked the perimeter of the house, taking notes, asking questions about renovations, utilities, and property boundaries. When she asked him who had filed the complaints, he simply shrugged and said the information was confidential. She knew. She didn't need to ask. When he left, he handed her a list of potential infractions that could result in fines if not addressed. It was all nonsense technicalities that had never been an issue before, things that wouldn't hold up under scrutiny, but it was more pressure, more paperwork, more stress. That night, Leslie barely slept. She kept hearing noises outside, footsteps in the sand, the faint rustling of bushes. Every time she looked, there was nothing there, but she felt it. The presence, the quiet, invisible invasion of her space. Then, one morning, she found her gate unlocked. She knew she had locked it the night before. She was certain. But now it was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. She walked the perimeter of the house, checking every door, every window. Nothing seemed out of place, but the unease settled deep in her bones. She started keeping a knife in her nightstand. David continued working on the legal case, confident that they would win, but Leslie was beginning to realize that Karen wasn't fighting a legal battle. She was fighting a psychological one. She was trying to break her down, to push her into giving up. And Leslie had no intention of giving her that satisfaction. She installed new locks. She double-checked every entry point. She kept a baseball bat by the door. She refused to let fear take hold. But Karen wasn't done. One night, long after midnight, Leslie was jolted awake by the sound of something scraping against her window. Her heart pounded as she reached for her phone, holding her breath as she listened. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate movement, like fingernails dragging against the glass. She sat up, gripping the handle of the bat, creeping toward the window. She pulled back the curtain. No one was there. But in the morning, she found footprints in the sand outside her bedroom. And that was when she knew. This wasn't about property anymore. Karen wanted her gone. And she was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. Leslie had always thought of herself as a rational person, someone who approached problems with logic rather than emotion. She had spent years working in unpredictable environments, analyzing marine ecosystems, navigating bureaucratic red tape and conservation efforts, and handling high-pressure situations with a level head. But nothing in her life had prepared her for the slow, calculated assault Karen was waging against her. The lawsuit, the fake complaints to the city, the real estate company letters, each piece felt like an attempt to chip away at her, to force her into exhaustion, but to make her question whether this fight was worth it. And yet, it was the smaller things that were starting to unnerve her the most. It was the way she would hear the faint creak of her porch steps at night, only to find no one there when she checked. It was the feeling of being watched when she stepped outside, the way Karen's curtains would flutter just slightly, as if she had been standing behind them and had stepped back the moment Leslie looked her way. It was the way little things in her home would seem just slightly off her keys, not where she left them. A cabinet door left open when she was sure she had closed it. The unmistakable scent of perfume that didn't belong to her lingering near her front door. David, ever the composed and pragmatic attorney, had reassured her that the lawsuit was nothing more than an intimidation tactic. "We'll force her to produce real evidence, and when she can't, it'll be dismissed," he had said, his tone confident, and Leslie believed him. Legally, Karen had no case. But this wasn't just a legal fight. Karen wasn't waiting for the courts to decide anything. She was playing by her own rules. One morning, after another sleepless night, Leslie stepped outside with her coffee, trying to shake off the lingering anxiety that clung to her. The early morning sun painted the horizon in soft oranges and pinks, the waves rolling lazily onto the shore. For a moment she allowed herself to relax, to pretend that everything was normal, that she wasn't in a battle for her own home. But then she saw it. There, in the sand, right outside her fence, was a wooden stake with a red ribbon tied around it. She set her coffee down, heart pounding, and walked over. The stake was driven deep into the ground, marking something. She scanned the area and realized there were more of them, dozens of small wooden stakes placed at intervals, forming an invisible grid across the property line. She knew what this was: a land survey. Karen had hired someone to conduct a private survey of the property, likely hoping to create some illusion of legitimacy for her claim. But Leslie hadn't authorized any such survey. She hadn't been notified of any changes to her boundary lines. This was something Karen had done in secret, without permission. Leslie marched toward Karen's house, jaw clenched, fists tight at her sides. She knocked sharply on the door, not caring if she was being aggressive. A few moments later, Karen opened it, her expression one of feigned innocence, as if she had no idea why Leslie was there. "Is there something I can help you with?" Karen asked, her tone syrupy sweet. "What the hell is with the survey markers on my land?" Leslie snapped. Karen blinked, as if surprised. "Oh, that? That's just for documentation purposes. Nothing to worry about." "Documentation for what?" Karen smiled, leaning casually against the doorframe. "I told you, Leslie, this case is going to take a while. I just want to make sure I have all my records in order for when we go to court. Wouldn't want any misunderstandings." Leslie's hands trembled with anger. "You don't have permission to be conducting surveys on my land." "Oh, but you see, I don't need your permission," Karen said, tilting her head slightly. "Because technically, part of that land isn't yours. At least that's what we'll be proving." Leslie stared at her, her body rigid with rage. Karen was enjoying this. She wanted Leslie to react, to lash out, to make a mistake that could be used against her. "I'm not playing this game with you," Leslie said through gritted teeth. Karen sighed, feigning disappointment. That's too bad. I was hoping we could handle this neighbor to neighbor. Leslie turned on her heel and walked away before she did something she'd regret. She immediately called David, who, upon hearing about the survey, was furious. She's overstepping big time. I'll get an injunction to stop any further surveying until this case is settled. If she sent surveyors onto your land without authorization, that's trespassing. That evening, Leslie double-checked all the locks on her doors and windows, reinforcing the security measures she had already put in place. She had installed motion-activated lights around the perimeter of the house, and as the sun set, she watched as they flickered on, illuminating the yard in bright, sterile white. But even with all the precautions, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. And she was right. At exactly 2:43 a.m., a loud crack echoed through the night, jolting her awake. She sat up, heart hammering against her ribs, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing but the sound of the waves outside, the steady rhythm of the tide. But then another noise. A rustling. Footsteps. Someone was on her property. She grabbed the baseball bat she kept by her nightstand and moved toward the window, careful not to turn on any lights. The motion sensor had been triggered, casting long shadows across her yard. And then she saw a figure moving along the side of her house. Her stomach clenched. It wasn't Karen. The silhouette was taller, bulkier. A man. She didn't hesitate. She picked up her phone and dialed 911, whispering her address to the dispatcher while keeping her eyes locked on the intruder's shadow. "There's someone on my property," she said quietly. "I don't know who. They're moving toward my back door." The dispatcher assured her that officers were on their way, but Leslie knew that in situations like this, minutes felt like hours. She tightened her grip on the bat, her breath slow and controlled. The figure stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, as if he could sense that she was watching, the man slowly turned his head toward the window and smiled. A chill ran down Leslie's spine. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the man turned and disappeared into the darkness. By the time the police arrived, there was no sign of him. No footprints, no evidence of forced entry. It was as if he had never been there at all. But Leslie knew what she had seen. The officers took her statement, but without tangible evidence, there wasn't much they could do beyond increasing patrols in the area. It could have been someone casing the house, one of them suggested, or it could have been a warning. Leslie knew which one it was. This wasn't a random break-in attempt. This was connected to Karen. She didn't know how, but she was sure of it, and she was done being scared. This was her home, and she would do whatever it took to defend it. Leslie had always believed that the legal system existed to protect people like her law-abiding citizens who followed the rules, paid their taxes, and simply wanted to be left in peace. But as the weeks dragged on, she was beginning to understand just how flawed that belief was. Karen had thrown her into a labyrinth of bureaucratic nonsense, a system that seemed designed to wear her down rather than to deliver justice. Every attempt to shut down the lawsuit only led to more paperwork, more procedural delays, more obstacles that kept the case alive just long enough to make Leslie's life miserable. The injunction David had filed against Karen's unauthorized survey should have ended that particular battle, but instead it triggered yet another legal maneuver. Karen's attorney filed a counterclaim, arguing that the survey was a necessary step in establishing rightful ownership. It was an absurd argument, one that had no basis in reality, but it meant that now, instead of simply dismissing the suit, Leslie had to go through yet another round of hearings, depositions, and legal motions. But it wasn't just the legal harassment that was getting to her. The psychological warfare was taking its toll as well. Since the night she had seen that man on her property, she had been unable to shake the feeling that she was constantly being watched. Every time she stepped outside, she found herself scanning the area, her eyes darting to the shadows, her ears straining for sounds that didn't belong. She had installed more security cameras, reinforced her locks, even changed the code on her alarm system, but it didn't make her feel any safer. Because whoever had been outside her window that night hadn't been looking to break in. He had been sending a message. The next escalation came in the form of a letter, slipped under her door in the middle of the night. There was no envelope, no stamp, just a single sheet of paper with 4 words written in sharp, black ink, "You don't belong here." Leslie read it 3 times before the full weight of it settled in her chest. It wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration of intent. Whoever had left this message wasn't just trying to scare her. They were trying to convince her that she was fighting a losing battle, that no matter how much she resisted, no matter how much evidence she had, she would never truly win. She didn't call the police this time. What was the point? There were no fingerprints, no security footage, nothing concrete they could use. Instead, she took a deep breath, folded the paper neatly, and tucked it into a drawer. Then she picked up her phone and called David. "You need to tell me how much worse this can get," she said the moment he answered. David sighed, and for the first time since this all started, she could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "It depends," he admitted. "Legally, Karen is running out of options. She's stalling, but at some point, a judge is going to see through it. The problem is, she knows that. So if she's determined to make you miserable, she's not going to stop just because the courts don't rule in her favor." Leslie rubbed her temples, feeling the dull throb of an oncoming headache. "So what do I do?" "You keep documenting everything," David said. "Every letter, every incident, every interaction. If this escalates any further, we'll have grounds for a restraining order." Leslie didn't say what they were both thinking, that a piece of paper wouldn't stop someone like Karen. The next morning, Leslie woke up to find her trash cans knocked over, the contents scattered across her driveway. At first, she thought it was just a raccoon or a stray dog, but as she bent down to start cleaning up, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A dead fish. It was placed deliberately in the center of the mess, its dull eyes staring up at her, its mouth gaping open, as if frozen mid-scream. And written in marker across its slick, silver scales was a single word: leave. She dropped the trash bag she had been holding and took a shaky step back. Her first instinct was to run inside, to lock the doors, to call someone, anyone, but she forced herself to stay calm. Instead, she pulled out her phone, snapped a picture, and sent it to David. "This is getting worse." David's response came almost immediately. "Call the police. Now." She hesitated. What would they even do? It wasn't like she could prove Karen had done it. There were no cameras pointed at the driveway, no witnesses, no evidence beyond the obvious implication. But she knew David was right. She couldn't keep letting this slide. The officers who arrived were polite but ultimately unhelpful. They took her statement, filed a report, and told her they would keep an eye on things. But that was it. No arrests, no real action, just more documentation. That night, Leslie barely slept. Every noise, every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows sent a jolt of adrenaline through her system. She found herself gripping the handle of the baseball bat she kept by her bed, waiting for anything to happen. And then, just as she was beginning to drift into a restless, uneasy sleep, she heard it. A single, deliberate knock on her front door. Not a pounding. Not an attempt to break in. Just a knock. She sat up, heart racing, staring at the door from across the room. Whoever was on the other side didn't say anything. They didn't call out. They just stood there, waiting. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. "There's someone outside my house," she whispered to the dispatcher. The knock came again. "Are they trying to enter?" the dispatcher asked. "No," Leslie said, barely breathing. "They're just standing there." "Stay on the line," the dispatcher instructed. "Officers are on their way." For what felt like an eternity, Leslie sat frozen, her pulse hammering in her ears. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the knocking stopped. She waited, listening, straining to hear footsteps retreating into the night. But there was nothing. When the police arrived, they found no sign of forced entry, no footprints, no indication that anyone had been there at all. But Leslie knew better. She wasn't just fighting a legal battle anymore. She was fighting something far more dangerous. And she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold her ground. Leslie no longer felt safe in her own home. The thought alone was maddening. This house had been her sanctuary, her inheritance, her past and future all tied into one. Now it felt like a fortress under siege. Every noise outside, every flicker of movement beyond her windows, every unfamiliar car parked on the street sent a wave of unease through her. She had done everything she could to secure her property, installed cameras, reinforced her doors, even filed multiple reports with the police, but none of it seemed to matter. Whoever was behind this wasn't deterred. They weren't trying to break in. They wanted her to feel the pressure, to understand that she was being watched, that her space was being invaded in ways she couldn't stop. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was psychological warfare. David was doing everything in his power to push the lawsuit forward, but Leslie could tell he was getting frustrated. The legal system wasn't built to handle cases like this, cases where one person weaponized bureaucracy while orchestrating a campaign of intimidation in the background. Karen had enough money to keep delaying hearings, enough persistence to keep the fight going, and enough nerve to do things that never left enough evidence to pin on her. It was a game of endurance, and Leslie was starting to feel like she was losing. Then, the bank notice arrived. At first, she thought it was a mistake, a clerical error, some mix-up with her mortgage payments. But as she read through the letter, a sickening realization settled over her. According to the document, a lien had been placed on her property due to unpaid debts. The amount was staggering, far beyond anything she could have possibly owed. Leslie felt her hands shake as she read through the details. The debt didn't belong to her, but it was tied to her property. Someone had falsified records, taken out fraudulent claims in her name, and now her house was flagged as a potential foreclosure risk. She called David immediately, barely able to keep her voice steady. "Tell me this is fixable," she pleaded. David exhaled sharply. "It's fixable," he assured her. "But it's not going to be easy. We need to challenge the lien, prove it was fraud, and that's going to take time." Time. That was the one thing she didn't have. Every delay worked in Karen's favor. Every bureaucratic hurdle kept Leslie tangled in red tape while the walls closed in around her. "Is there any way to fast-track this?" she asked. "I'll do everything I can," David said. "But you need to be careful. This is getting serious." As if it hadn't already been serious enough. That night, Leslie barely slept. She kept replaying the events of the past few weeks, trying to piece together Karen's next move. This wasn't random. Karen had a plan, a strategy, a long-game approach that was slowly but surely pushing Leslie to the brink. First, the lawsuit, then the intimidation tactics, now financial sabotage. And then, just when she thought it couldn't get worse, the power went out. It happened at exactly 2:17 a.m. Leslie knew because she had been staring at the clock, willing herself to fall asleep, when suddenly the entire house was plunged into darkness. The hum of the refrigerator stopped. The security system's standby light blinked off. The street outside, usually illuminated by soft amber lamps, was pitch black. A power outage? Maybe. But Leslie didn't believe in coincidences anymore. She grabbed her flashlight and moved cautiously through the house, her pulse hammering in her ears. She checked the circuit breaker first. Everything was in place. No trip switches, no blown fuses. That's when she knew. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this, and then she heard it. A soft shuffling noise coming from outside. She froze, heart pounding. Someone was in her yard. She moved to the nearest window, pressing herself against the wall as she peered through the curtain. At first, she saw nothing but darkness, the faint outlines of trees swaying in the wind. Then movement. A shadow just beyond the fence line. Leslie's grip tightened around the flashlight. She wasn't going to just sit there waiting for whatever came next. She grabbed her phone and called the police, her voice a whisper as she explained the situation. "There's someone outside my house," she said. The power was cut. "I don't know how many of them there are." The dispatcher assured her that officers were on the way, but Leslie had learned not to expect immediate results. She wasn't helpless. She wouldn't be a passive target. She moved quietly through the house, securing the doors, making sure the windows were locked. She retrieved the small pistol she had purchased after the last break-in attempt, keeping it within reach. Then silence. For long minutes there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the heavy weight of anticipation pressing down on her. She strained her ears, listening, waiting. And then footsteps. Not just one person. Multiple. They were in her yard. Her breath hitched. She raised the gun, heart hammering. A beam of light cut through the darkness, a flashlight, scanning the area. Then a voice. Low, unfamiliar. "Nothing here." "Let's go." Footsteps retreating. A car engine starting. By the time the police arrived, there was nothing left to find. No signs of forced entry. No security footage because, of course, the cameras had gone offline when the power was cut. Leslie knew what the police were going to say before they even opened their mouths. "We'll file a report. We'll increase patrols in the area. Let us know if anything else happens." She felt like screaming. Instead, she turned to David the next morning and said, "I want to go after her. Hard." David studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Then we stop playing defense. We start digging into Karen." For the first time since this nightmare began, Leslie felt a spark of hope. She wasn't just going to survive this, she was going to win. Leslie had spent weeks feeling like she was on the defensive, reacting to every move Karen made, trying to keep up with the relentless attacks against her home, her finances, her sense of security. But something had shifted inside her. The fear that had gripped her at the beginning had hardened into something else, something sharper. She was done being the one who flinched, done waiting for the next blow to land. Karen wanted a war. Fine. Leslie would give her one. David had been hesitant at first when she told him she wanted to go after Karen directly, but after the power outage and the trespassing incident, he stopped urging caution. He had seen the escalation for what it was, an outright attempt to break her. "We'll push back hard," he said, his voice firm. "We'll file for an emergency hearing to challenge the fraudulent lien and bring up the harassment as part of our argument. We'll subpoena her records, dig into her finances. If she's pulling this on you, chances are she's done it before. We just need to find proof." The hearing was set for the following week, but Leslie knew that Karen wasn't going to sit idly by while her scheme unraveled. That suspicion was confirmed the night before the hearing, when Leslie was jolted awake by the sound of her door handle rattling. She didn't hesitate this time. She reached for the gun she kept on her nightstand, heart hammering as she crept toward the door. The security system was armed, but she didn't trust it to stop whoever was out there. As she reached the entryway, she saw the shadow through the frosted glass. Someone was standing on her porch. Leslie's finger hovered over the trigger as she took a steadying breath and called out, "I'm armed." Step away from the door. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then a slow, deliberate chuckle. "Come on, Leslie," a voice murmured. "Karen." Leslie felt her stomach twist. "What the hell are you doing?" Leslie demanded, keeping her grip steady on the gun. "Just thought we should talk," Karen said. "Face to face. You've been making things very difficult for me." Leslie swallowed the rage bubbling up inside her. "You need to leave. Now." Karen sighed dramatically. "You know, I really didn't want it to come to this," she said. "But you just wouldn't take the hint." Leslie tensed. "What hint?" Karen leaned in, her face just barely visible through the glass. "That this isn't a fight you can win. The words were calm, almost gentle, but Leslie heard the threat buried beneath them. She had heard it in every move Karen had made since this nightmare began. Then Karen reached into her jacket. Leslie reacted instinctively, raising the gun. "Don't," she warned. Karen smirked and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it up so Leslie could see it. "Relax. Just a little something I wanted you to read." She slipped it under the door. "See you in court, neighbor." With that, she turned and walked away. Leslie exhaled slowly, waiting until Karen had disappeared down the road before bending down to retrieve the paper. She unfolded it, her hands shaking slightly, and felt her blood turn to ice. It was a copy of a purchase agreement for her house. Her stomach lurched as she scanned the document. It was dated 2 days ago, with Karen listed as the buyer. The price was insultingly low, a fraction of what the property was worth. And at the bottom, next to the space where Leslie's signature should have been, was an official-looking notation, "Pending legal action. Transfer in process." Rage flooded through her. Karen was trying to create the illusion that the house was already hers, manipulating records, planting false paperwork, twisting reality to suit her narrative. It didn't matter that it wasn't legal. It created confusion, enough to delay, enough to keep the chaos going just a little longer. Leslie had seen enough. She wasn't going to let Karen take another step forward. The next morning, she walked into the courthouse with David at her side, her jaw set, her spine straight. She refused to let Karen see even a sliver of hesitation. As they entered the hearing room, Karen was already there, seated with her lawyer, looking as smug as ever. But when their eyes met, something shifted. For the first time, Leslie saw a flicker of uncertainty in Karen's gaze. David wasted no time, laying out the evidence in crisp, undeniable detail. The fraudulent lien, the unauthorized survey, the threats, the intimidation, the trespassing. And then, the final blow, proof that Karen had done this before. David had found a case from 5 years ago, another homeowner who had been forced into a legal battle with Karen over a similar claim. The pattern was identical: the fraudulent paperwork, the harassment, the legal delays. But that homeowner had eventually been bullied into selling, signing over their property just to make it stop. Not this time. "This is not just a simple property dispute," David said, his voice carrying through the courtroom. "This is a pattern of behavior, a calculated scheme to manipulate the system and intimidate property owners into surrendering their homes. And it ends today." Karen's lawyer tried to deflect, but the judge wasn't interested. The fraud was too blatant, the connections too obvious. The ruling came swiftly. Karen's lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning she could never file another claim on Leslie's home again. The fraudulent lien was erased, and as an added bonus, the judge referred Karen's actions to the state attorney's office for possible criminal charges. Leslie sat still as the decision was read, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had won. She had actually won. Karen, meanwhile, had gone pale. For the first time since this nightmare began, she had lost control, and she knew it. As they left the courthouse, Karen stormed past Leslie without a word, her carefully constructed facade finally cracking. Leslie didn't say anything either. She didn't need to. The fight was over, and Karen had lost. Leslie sat on her porch, the warm ocean breeze rolling over her skin as she stared out at the horizon, letting the reality of her victory settle in. For weeks, she had been drowning in legal battles, harassment, and fear, but now, for the first time in what felt like forever, she could finally breathe. The house was hers, indisputably, irrevocably. The court had shut Karen down in every possible way, dismissing her fraudulent claims and wiping away the fabricated liens that had threatened to steal Leslie's home out from under her. But the battle had taken its toll. The sleepless nights, the paranoia, the constant feeling of being watched, none of it had disappeared overnight. Even though Karen had been thoroughly defeated, even though her schemes had been exposed for what they were, Leslie knew she wasn't the kind of person who accepted failure easily. Karen had left the courthouse without a word, her face twisted with barely contained rage, and that silence unsettled Leslie more than any threats she had made before. There had been no outbursts, no parting shots, no dramatic attempts to turn the tables at the last moment. Just cold, simmering fury. And that made Leslie wary. A woman like Karen didn't just walk away without trying to set something on fire on her way out. So Leslie stayed vigilant. She reinforced the security around her home, made sure every lock and camera was functioning, and kept a close watch on the property. For the first few days after the ruling, nothing happened. Karen's house sat dark and still, no signs of movement, no cars pulling into the driveway. It was as if she had disappeared entirely. The quiet should have been comforting, but instead it put Leslie even more on edge. She knew Karen wasn't the type to back down without one final act of defiance. And sure enough, on the fourth night, Leslie found out she had been right. It started with the sound of an engine idling outside her house, low and steady, just beyond her property line. She had been sitting in her living room, reading through some old documents, when she heard it, an unmistakable presence just outside. She set down the papers, moving cautiously toward the window, her pulse quickening as she peered through the blinds. A car sat parked on the road, its headlights off, just barely visible in the dim glow of the street lamp. She couldn't see inside, but she didn't need to. She knew who it was. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Leslie remained frozen by the window, watching, waiting. Then, slowly, the driver's side door opened, and Karen stepped out. She stood there, just beyond the property line, her arms crossed, her face unreadable in the shadows. She didn't come any closer. She didn't call out. She just stood there, staring at the house like it had personally betrayed her. Leslie didn't flinch. She didn't move to confront her. She just reached for her phone and dialed the police. She didn't even have to say anything when they answered. "She's here," Leslie said simply. They didn't ask who. They knew. By the time the squad car pulled up, Karen was gone. No signs of forced entry, no direct threats, just the lingering presence of her anger hanging heavy in the air. The officer took Leslie's statement, nodded along as she explained what had happened, then offered her the same words she had heard a dozen times before. "Let us know if she comes back." But Karen didn't come back, at least not in person. The next day, Leslie got a call from David. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his tone edged with exhaustion. "Karen's selling her house." Leslie blinked. "What?" "She listed it this morning. It's already being shown to potential buyers." For a moment, Leslie didn't know how to react. The idea that Karen would voluntarily leave after everything she had done, after how hard she had fought to take what didn't belong to her, seemed impossible. But at the same time, it made sense. Karen had lost. She had been publicly humiliated, legally defeated, and exposed for the fraud she was. There was nothing left for her here. "She's running," Leslie murmured. David sighed. "Looks like it." Leslie wasn't naive enough to think that Karen would just disappear quietly. People like her didn't change. They found new places, new victims, new ways to manipulate the system. But it didn't matter anymore. Not to Leslie, because Karen was no longer her problem. A few weeks later, the moving trucks came. Leslie watched from her porch as Karen's belongings were packed away, as the last traces of her presence were erased from the neighborhood. She didn't go over to gloat, didn't say a word as Karen's car pulled out of the driveway for the final time. She just stood there, arms crossed, watching as the woman who had tried to steal everything from her drove away with nothing. That night, for the first time in months, Leslie slept soundly. No nightmares, no waking up at the slightest sound, no tension coiled in her chest like a wound waiting to snap. Just peace. The house was hers, and she was never letting anyone take it from her again.